It's our last session, and we're taking everything that we've gone through between design, dev, budgeting, and everything in between and consolidating it to development-ready specifications, or what is it exactly that you're going to hand off to a developer that you're working with, or if it's not necessarily handoff, at least the starting point of the collaboration between you and a developer that you're working with on a regular basis. So I wanted to start with a pretty simple checklist that I think more or less will give you coverage for dev-ready specifications. So before we dive into the details, just want to go through this list here. So you want to make sure that before you get into the details, somebody gets what is it that you're building. So using Tell Me Like I'm Five language, explain the skateboard, explain the context of the application. Then make sure that you're giving context. Is it a new app, a feature to an existing app? Is it an iOS app? Is it an Android app? Is it both? Make it clear what's already covered, like if you have a backend done. Explain your mission, your why. This part, I think, gets neglected a lot. People think that developers just need code or designs. They're people just like you, and they want to be motivated to work on the things they're motivated on. And I think the why is one of the things that gets ignored the most. So if you're working on something that's unique, if you have a specific reason why you're working on it, share that. I remember we ran a similar program, not quite FoundLab, but something similar, where we did a contest for development credit more than a year ago now, partnered with Spacious. And I remember the winners all had, it wasn't the best designs, it wasn't necessarily the most interesting tech, it was the best stories. And I remember those really stood out, and those are the ones that caught someone. And then finally, designs. You want to make sure that you're sharing them in a modern design tool. It doesn't necessarily have to be Figma or Sketch. Those are just great tools to use. And if you're using Sketch, Zeppelin or Avocode or one of those is great, because it just translates the designs into something that a developer can look at without having to go through more steps like open the design software, install it themselves, etc. You want to make sure that you've got end-to-end coverage. You're not just giving like a random starting point without context or a random ending point without context. And really easy to get wrong, but really important. Use real names and use cases. Lorem ipsum is great for like wireframing or very early stages of design. But once you're actually handing something to a developer, lorem ipsum is a good way to confuse someone or at least slow them down. So on that first one, which I think is pretty easy, I just wanted to give a quick example of this like profile screen that we've showed a couple times. So on the left is a lorem ipsum version. First name, last name, skill, kind of, it even describes what is it that's in there. But think about, if you were looking at just the left side of the screen, you have to use your imagination to even create the context of this being a profile. While on the right side, it's instant. You don't even have to look at the details of the skill sets or the local time or anything. It's because you can associate this with something you've seen before. You can relate this very quickly to a profile. So imagine yourselves in the seat of being a developer. Of course, you'll have to eventually get into the details of what is the icon here, what is the button here, what is it supposed to do. But at least you've been able to skip the steps of what am I even looking at from a fundamental level of the profile. It makes instant sense when you have the content on the right, the placeholders on the left, where it takes a little longer to get caught up. So just summarizing what that is in written form in case anybody's reviewing it later. And to finish off this point, it's fine for prototyping, but once you're actually handing something off, you want someone to get it as quickly as possible. And this all kind of boils down to, I would say, an abstraction of UX, not the original UX of the actual product. So there's the UX of your actual product, so what your end users are getting, but you're also handing these specs off to another person. So that process of handing it off to someone, I consider it is UX. How quickly is it that they're going to absorb something? How likely is it that they can confuse something in here? The same way that you think about UX for an end user, in the context of handing over development-ready specs to a developer, you should be thinking about the UX of how they receive it. I've seen lots of specs come in as like 4 separate emails. And just imagine a developer having to like string those together, pick those up, understand how that all fits together. If you're working with an agency that you're paying a high price for someone to kind of handhold and manage all that, great. But I don't think that any of you are here because you want to work with high-priced agencies. I think you want to be in control of the development process yourself. So fundamentally, just remember that handoff is user experience, and you want to focus on the user experience of the person receiving those specs. And the simplest checklist I can think of is examples, metaphors, and designs. So come with as many examples as possible. Use metaphors wherever possible, just because they can help someone get it as quickly as possible. And go heavy on designs. The majority of specs should be designs. They should be visual. They should show what the end result of a product looks like. But those should be paired with examples of what your product is, metaphors of what your product is similar to, so people can kind of glue it to what they're already used to. And of course, the designs themselves. Any questions so far before we get into the real spec examples?
I was curious to when you're trying to get people excited about your idea or app or whatever, and you're handing it basically the spec to the developer, then how much would you put emphasis on like sort of building a big story around your mission versus like sort of the tech stack that they would likely be using? So the sort of the text challenge that they might have versus what's the end outcome?
That's a great question. I would make sure that the story is in there, but I wouldn't force it. I think not to like group developers into one kind of person. Everybody's their own unique individual and have their very clear differences. But they do tend to be logical, process-oriented people that see through BS pretty quickly. So I guess the upper threshold of the story is make sure it doesn't read like BS. But there needs to be a lower threshold there where you need to at least say why you're the person that should be working on this, why it matters for the world, why it matters in some context. So it should not be more important than the actual specs, but it needs to be a box that you check. Like it shouldn't take precedence over the actual designs and become like this like long story, but there needs to be at least, don't overcomplicate it. It should be, hey, I've been a police officer for 20 years, so I'm building a product for police officers to save more lives. Like that's a perfect example of, you clearly show that you're an expert in the field. You show that there's a real reason for this to exist. And we did that in like 1 or 2 sentences. I wouldn't complicate it more than that, but I would absolutely make sure that you check that box of that motivational factor there.
And would you put any focus on how hard the technical challenges are going to be, just to sort of get them excited, or no?
I wouldn't, because that's kind of in some cases, yes. Like if you were a industry-leading developer that spent your career working on something very deep and technical and complicated, and you're that expert, and you can get someone excited about that technicality, absolutely, and run with that. Like we're working with someone at Turtle. He's a new customer that he spent like 15 years working on Google Chrome at Google and thinking about sync. And that's like what he's an expert on in the field. So he can go really, really deep into online, offline sync, and he can get someone excited about that because he's an expert in that field. But if I try to do that because I'm not an expert in that field, it would come off fake and it just wouldn't land. It wouldn't actually motivate someone. It would probably, the more realistic interpretation would be they're overcomplicating the app, or Vlad doesn't know what he's talking about, or some other BS flag would come up. So I would say to make sure to balance that technical motivation with that same kind of BS flag logic. So yes, they want the product to be exciting, but it's more likely to excite them, like unless you're an extremely technical person that's like, you're going to use your own experience to motivate them on a specific technicality. I would use clear instructions, the ability for them to move autonomously, like maybe say that this is a new app. So I've seen a new app excite people more than something like a very complicated technology, because somebody doesn't have to deal with somebody else's code. So I get where you're coming from. You're just like, you want it to be exciting from a technical level. But in reality, not having to deal with someone else's code tends to excite people pretty quickly too, or something like that. So, it's good that you're thinking about this being interesting. I would just say not I would just say to balance it with, you know, not BSing your way there, you know? Cool. All right. And I want to bring back this context, action, outcome slide that we looked at from our design sessions. It's incredibly relevant for specs, and you should be looking at things from this perspective throughout. So this is a super simplified version because it's just 3 screens, but in the context of your own specifications, you should be able to put a frame of context, action, outcome around either an entire flow, parts of a flow, individual screens, and ideally the entire spec process together. So in here, we've got very simple context. In an entire spec, we might explain if it's just an iOS app or an Android app, if it's a new product or if it's building on top of an existing product, if there's a backend that's being used or there's a custom backend or if you're using Firebase, all of those things create context. And the actual flow will be your action, and then that outcome, that end result with real examples, not using kind of lorem ipsum tax, but to show somebody that after you've done all this, this should be your end result. It should also be in those flows. So I want to just bring back this checklist before we dive into an example so that we can kind of compare against that checklist, see what we hit, see what's missing, and then we'll work through a few examples of kind of just designs and then what we can do to actually get them to cover all these checklist pieces. So I think we've seen just the design of this before in an earlier session, but I wanted to bring this back because I think it's a pretty clear example from the design side, and then we can kind of frame everything else around it. So if a developer just got this actually isn't terrible because of the simplicity of the application and the clarity of the designs. So if you just handed this off to someone else just to level set like the rest of the market for people working with developers, kind of early stages or for the first time, you're already probably better than like 9 out of 10 people that submit specs if this is all that you submit. You'd be surprised with how unclear specifications can be. That said, if we look at this in context of the checklist, we've sort of kind of got our designs covered, but nothing else. So we don't know, is this an iPhone app? Is this an Android app? We don't know if there's a backend that already exists. We don't know if this is an existing application. If I was a developer receiving this, I would have a lot of questions before I could get started. So in the best case scenario, if I was able to phrase the right questions, after some iteration, we could finally get to dev-ready specs. But if we look at things in context of this checklist, it's pretty simple things that you can do to turn that design alone into dev-ready specifications. So here, let's just kind of go through it from top to bottom. So I said who I am. I said that I've been working with naval officers for most of my career. So I established that I know what I'm talking about in this space. I said that military coins are shared by more than 100,000 people per year. There's no way of sharing them on social networks, et cetera, now. 100,000 people, that's a lot of people. So now as a developer, it's like, I didn't even know that these military coins existed, but now all of a sudden there's an expert in the field, there's 100,000 people to share them to. Then I give the context of what is it that I'm even building? What is that skateboard? It's press a button, share their coin. And then I give an example metaphor. It's essentially Instagram for sharing military coins. So now whenever I look at those designs, I can equate this to, okay, well, Instagram has press a button, have your picture shared on your profile or to others. This is essentially the same context, except it's just focused on these military coins. Before I even get into the designs, I can describe my core flow. Then I finally have the design link. I did put in here in just text that I'll be sure to put this in Zeppelin before sharing. Does everybody remember what Zeppelin or Avocode is? For those, we got some thumbs up, so great. For those that don't, just it takes a design file and makes it into something that you can share with a link. And that way developers don't actually have to install the design, like whether you do it in InDesign or Photoshop or Illustrator or Sketch, you essentially feed it through Zeppelin. Zeppelin creates a web view version of that design. And that way a developer doesn't have to install the actual design software. This is important in thinking about kind of the UX of receiving specifications, because imagine that, the worst case is I get like 3 separate emails and then I have to like glue that information together. It's actually not bad to have someone install Sketch or use something like that. Like, it happens all the time. But if you can save a developer that step, then they can put their energy on thinking about your problem, thinking about how they're going to solve it, thinking about how they're going to work on it. Finally, I put in the context here, there currently is no backend. Firebase would be great. This is a new app, iPhone only. So So now we have, starting from the designs with about 1 page of content, basically all of our sections checked. The only one that I didn't leave checked was just that technicality on Zeppelin, because we just said that we're going to send it through Zeppelin and haven't really yet. Reminder that with Figma, you don't need to send it through something like Zeppelin. So with Figma, it already creates a URL link, and there's kind of already some of those pieces of Zeppelin built into Figma. So you wouldn't have to send it through Zeppelin as well. So yeah, I want to just go back on these 2 slides and just show how quickly we went from something that was a design and already had the hard parts done, but didn't necessarily check all the boxes for dev-ready specifications. And then with 1 page of content, we created it into something that does check all those boxes and does create dev-ready specifications. If somebody delivered things in this format, whether it was an email or a presentation or a single doc, with a link to that design and this description, this would be something that most developers could understand very quickly. That said, things aren't done in kind of a black box. You're still going to collaborate with developers. They're still going to maybe tell you where they think that you should or shouldn't focus your energy, where maybe you need to adjust the design or not. So it is a collaborative process before you get to actual code. That said, this would be a great starting point. And we've done it all in just 1 page. Any questions on this? I think this one's really important to focus on, the specific page, because it kind of lays the framework for a simple but complete spec. And I think a lot of what you're working on could come into this format as well.
Maybe slightly question on a different thing. Have you ever found intro screens to be an effective way how to introduce an app?
I wouldn't make it your first skateboard. Like, it's not the most important thing to do first, but if this is an app that's going beyond just you and your co-founders, like typically a first skateboard is you're going to use it. That's it. You're not worrying about login. You're not worrying about intro screens. Like, you already have the context of the app. So if it's a very, very first skateboard, I wouldn't worry about it. But if it is a product that you want others to use, the technical implementation of intro screens are really, really easy. It's essentially slicing, like it's essentially just putting 4 images into the same frame and swiping through it. So from development implementation standpoint, it's quick and easy compared to some things in an app that could get very complicated. So I do think that the kind of ROI is pretty good. It just doesn't take much time to implement something like that. And the reward is not only do the developers working on it get clear context and that this is how I would use the app, but also your end users get that clear context, which is the reason to have those intro screens in there. So I wouldn't do it for a very first skateboard, but I do think it's pretty good use of development energy and design time and just space in the app to before you actually hit customers.
Okay, like the question was just because like there are more and more apps, which is basically you open it and you get thrown into the content with the ability to sign up later, and the hope is that the context would come from a friend that had referred you to the app.
Yeah, it really does depend on the product. Like if your product can tell the story without having to have those intro screens, that's great. I think that's more of a design consideration than necessarily dev. I don't think there are that many products that could very quickly show you things without a walkthrough, and a walkthrough that you can skip just offers some insurance for those people that don't have that context. So with how little it costs to implement something like intro screens, I do think it's generally worth it. Obviously there's exceptions to that rule, but I think for just how cheap it is to implement something like that compared to other dev pieces, you're not touching a database, you're not having to read, write, or anything like that. You're not doing any kind of visual manipulation. It's quite literally just swiping through 3 or 4 pictures. So it's just really easy implementation that can go a long way into offering someone context about the product. So unless your product is uniquely simple and that you really don't need even like 1 or 2 intro screens to get it, I do think it's worth it. All right. I wanted to add, so specific, and this might work specifically for those applying for the credit, beyond just the basics of specs, I would consider a video walkthrough of your designs with you actually giving a walkthrough in that context. This could be a great way to tell that story of who you are and why you're working on this and why the product matters. Loom is a great app to use for this. It just like gives a little avatar at the bottom of the screen, records your screen, and gives you a shareable link. There's a lot of other ways that you can do it. You can do it with QuickTime. You can do it with any kind of like recording app. I really like Loom because it's just really easy to use. Share your plans beyond the current scope, the North Star and the why. This helps define what is it that you're building, why, and kind of what is your vision. And it can help define that you're reasonable as a customer, as a designer, as a leader to say like, this is what we're doing now and this is what we're not doing now. Because it helps you define what does and doesn't fit in the scope while still showing that you're thinking beyond it. You do have that vision, but that you're a reasonable person that understands that not everything is going to fit into this first phase. Kind of on the same lines, point out nice to haves, but not necessary. The purpose of that, though, is actually if you end up in the context of the 100-hour competition here, if you end up with just more time in your budget and nice to haves that could be covered, it again not only covers that time, but gives someone the idea that you've thought about what's core, what isn't core, what fits into those first 100 hours, what doesn't. So the difference between these last 2 points is this one gives the North Star, oops, sorry. The second one gives the North Star and shares that you're able to separate what is and isn't critical for this phase. And that last one acts more as filler for if someone didn't actually end up using all that budget. The last one I would put the least energy on because nice to haves are, it's rare that nice to haves are important enough to actually prioritize. You're more likely to spend budget and iteration working on the core pieces that have been there in the feedback that may have come from it. But if you're presenting things in specs, it's not a bad idea to include them. I wanted to work through a few examples here that are starting with just designs, but then we can think about the missing pieces in context and also think about what things may look like if you're just wireframing something or using a UI framework, because we've talked through all these sessions about two kind of approaches. One is you custom design everything and what you build is exactly what it looks like. And the other one is you're using UI frameworks and really you're wireframing, putting process flows together and then pointing to UI frameworks so that you're not worrying about the specific pixels. You're really just worrying about the flow. So here we have a flow of basically an app for Nest. It's wireframed in Greyscale. It does show kind of the login screen, the loading screen, et cetera. But I would not call this dev-ready specifications. Anybody want to jump in and maybe point out some things that are missing here or that could complete this into dev-ready specifications? Let me see if I can zoom out so you can see the whole thing here. Nope.
I would say I would want lots and lots more annotations than this. Like it looks like there's like some lorem ipsum style filler. There should be descriptions of what that text should actually be. And yeah. It seems really sparse to me.
Yeah, that's an easy one. So it is sparse in description. One thing on description that I think fundamentally is missing here is what is it that we are building? Like we jump right into designs and we know that it's Nest, but I have no idea if this is a controller for existing Nest, if this is a way to order new Nest devices. Like until I sit through and actually go through all 15 screens, I have no context. So this is missing that original context most fundamentally too. Anybody else? Things that could be nice to add to this design and make it dev ready? Let's compare it to the checklist here. So there is no intro. I don't know what the skateboard is. There is no context. I don't know if it's a new app, an existing app, if it's a specific feature. I don't know if there's a backend. I have no idea there. I don't know the mission. I don't know anything. Really, it's just sort of kind of checking part of the designs I'm not even sure that it's got end-to-end coverage in there. So something that started as a pretty complete and annotated looking design. Someone spent time working on the hard parts of this. They've worked on making the design cleanly laid out and annotating things in a way that's easy enough to follow, but they're missing the fundamentals. And those fundamentals would be necessary for a developer to pick this up. That, and this kind of looks more like wireframes to me than full-on designs. Nobody would be implementing these kind of grayscale boxes. So something like this would either have to go through final design to become dev ready, because you don't want to waste time implementing something that's gray boxes, or be paired with the UI framework. Examples of those are Material UI, Semantic UI, and a bunch of others that are out there for iOS, Android, React Native that can be used. But this is totally missing those fundamentals, the story behind it, the motivation, the everything else. It's like they spent time on the hard parts, but very little on the necessary but easier parts. Then let's do one more. So this is our buddy Alex. Sorry. Nick has a quick question. Yeah, Nick, go ahead.
Thanks, Bob. So in terms of talking about pairing with a framework, pairing with Material UI or whatever, if you were to go back to that nest, and let's say that they provided context and the story and the skateboard, etc., right? And they had these predominantly grayscale explanations, and then in addition explained like, hey, this is because this is prototyping with, let's say, 10 people or 100 people, we're using a framework, and we're using grayscale to begin with. Is that acceptable?
I would ask what experience your developers have with a specific UI framework. Here's what will happen. So let's say that we're using Semantic UI. To give everyone context and to UI frameworks again, you don't have to design the thing. You can basically just pick different components that you use. So you don't have to worry about like sizing for different browsers, et cetera. The main downside for this is a lack of customization. So let's just look at elements here like a table. Yeah. So if I was working with a developer that was very familiar with Semantic UI, knew their way around Semantic UI, I would probably just communicate with those grayscale boxes and ask them to use their best interpretation of what's in the UI framework that fits that. Now that's with the context of a developer is familiar with that specific UI framework. If I asked the developer if they're familiar with the UI framework and they said no, then there becomes a trade-off situation. If you handed off grayscale designs and asked them to use the UI framework, then they would have to dig through the UI framework themselves, find things that match the designs or close to it, push back on you in places where they don't, and kind of they have to do that translation from grayscale designs into what fits the UI framework. The other trade-off is you spend the time studying the UI framework and find different pieces that fit, so that instead of just handing things off in grayscale, you're either literally screenshotting different components that you can use or referencing those components specifically, so that when somebody's reading through it, they're not just reading, oh, there's a login screen, it's a grayscale login screen, but I'm actually going to use this specific component of the UI framework. So the trade-off there for the case of a developer not knowing the UI framework is either they're going to spend the time translating grayscale into the UI framework, or you can spend the time studying the UI framework enough to be able to translate it to them. And while this might look like code and intimidating, like I don't need to look at the actual code. I just need to look at like, here's tables, here's buttons. If I want to use a button, I'm going to use something like this version, or I want to use an animated button. Like there's a bunch of examples that'll come in here, and yes, there's some digging that you'll have to do. But there's no reason why somebody that isn't a developer can't go through here and find the parts of the UI framework that they think are most applicable.
And in the context specifically about presenting this, just referencing back to, like, because we generally use frameworks, and we, when I hand off to Brendan, I'll reference like, this is, for example, on the screen, this is an inverted button. Yeah. And then he'll just go grab that, and then that'll be, what he takes. Is that, you're saying that's acceptable?
Yeah. It's, think about it at like time zones. So if you're on the West Coast and somebody else is on the East Coast, and you ask them, can you meet at 9 p.m. or 9 a.m. Pacific time, then they have to be the one that says, okay, 9 a.m. Pacific time, when it's going to be 12 noon. So before they're able to even answer your question or interpret it, they have to do that translation. versus if you told them, knowing that they're on the East Coast, hey, can you meet at 12 p.m.? So that way they can just instantly answer you. It's the exact same thing here. Is your starting point a reference to the actual UI framework piece so that they can just look at it and immediately know? Or is it something that they have to then look at and then translate into what part of the UI framework may or may not fit this?
Got it. Thank you.
All right. So now we have our, this is the last example I wanted to use. We have our friend Alex. He designed a way to looks like borrow dogs or share dogs, etc. Looks like we got Filbert at 1 p.m. Yeah. So in this one, there are similar pieces missing to the prior example, but I do want to point out that a very strong design could be motivation on itself. Most developers looking at this would probably, like, people love dogs, people like great design or simple design. There's enough motivational factor in here because that we're running on the strength of a great design that it actually does start checking some of those boxes. And the design is specific enough that I know that this is an iPhone app. This is designed for an iPhone. It's in the context of an iPhone. So I'm actually checking more boxes on our checklist than what we would have I'm checking a little more of those boxes than I would have originally. So here's that original list. So I don't have intro language, so I don't actually know the skateboard, but there is some visual language that sort of gets there. I do have some context. I know that it's an iPhone app, but I don't know if it's a new app or if it's adding features to one. I don't know if there's a backend or anything like that. I actually don't know the mission, but the designs are pretty well covered. So I kind of sort of check another maybe half a box or so. But in the same style of our last example, I think going through a one-pager really explaining, you know, I used to foster dogs, or I have a dog, or some other context as to why this even matters to you. You know, explain that dogs can help with loneliness or depression or anything like that, or some other story behind why this matters. Context can be as simple as this is a new iPhone app. Backend can be as simple as we're going to use Firebase, or there's already an existing backend. And the design piece is pretty covered. I also want to bring back this idea of budget and timeline. So we talked about specs, and throughout the course we've been, or throughout the sessions we've been talking about fixed timeline, fixed budget, fixed scope. So this is going to be really easy for those going for the competition. We're going to set the rates at 50 instead of 55 rates with a Copilot on Turtle. So with 5K, that's going to get you 100 hours. We're going to fix the timeline at 2 months so that everybody's working within a 2-month max timeline. So depending on what developer you might get matched with, that might be a little shorter. But I do want to give everyone this just fixed context of whatever designs we're working in. There's always, in the context of the submissions, there's going to be 100 hours and 2 months. So if we look at 100 hours and 2 months with this example, I can tell you it got finished in less than 100 hours, and that included actually a custom backend. It didn't have all the fancy bells and whistles and tons of iteration, but when we went through in the budgeting session, this example, it was like 86 hours with a custom backend, a basic but custom backend in Node.js. Built in Firebase, that would have taken even less. This would have been like a 50 to 60 hour front-end app with a basic Firebase implementation, which would have left 30, 40 hours more for iteration after that. And you know, looking at these first few screens, these are intro screens, so it really didn't take any time to develop these. The Facebook one, they're using an outside login system, so it's pretty quick, and it's really just kind of similar design to these intro screens. There wasn't anything new that had to get built there. These 4 screens are really where the real app starts. So it's authenticating with the camera, it's making sure that you can store and flip that camera, adding some basic form logic, and then finally this share to Facebook, which doesn't look like it's defining the designs, but actually did get worked through as well within that same budget. Oops. I just want to reiterate this like UX of the person receiving it. I don't think people spend nearly enough time thinking about this. They think about, you know, did I get all the designs right? Do I have every pixel laid out right? Do I have a style guide or whatever else that I can include in here? And I think they spend very little time thinking about the actual handoff to a developer. Like, how is a developer literally receiving it? Is it in the context of an email? Is it a PDF? Is it a video? Is there going to be a phone call to be able to explain this? So thinking about things from somebody's totally new and hasn't ever met you or seen your product before, what is the best way to present that to them? So I would encourage you to use slides, videos, very easy to follow intro content. Tell that story and make it easy to absorb before you get into the details, and keep it as brief as possible, and really highlight examples, metaphors, and make it something they can relate to. Before we wrap up, I do want to also bring in our core concepts of the 10X rule and skateboarding and how they fit into this process. So if you've spent more than 10 hours designing something on here, it's very unlikely that it's going to fit into the specs of 100 hours. So I would use that 10X rule to just help define, is this realistically within 100 hours or not? The skateboarding piece, I would make sure to cut any parts that you're not sure about, that aren't core to the process, and really make sure that in your specs you're defining what is that one skateboard, so that if things don't go to plan, if there's other stuff that you have to add, you can still come back to what is that skateboard, have we accomplished it? I press a button, I share a coin. Sharing to Facebook, whatever, like that was a nice to have, but it wasn't the core experience. It's, can I press a button and share a coin very quickly with my iPhone? Dollars, pixel, and code relation. I'm really just highlighting this to make sure that we don't forget about how these three really fit together, and not much takeaway for specs there. Finally, resources. I put 2 links here. So there's a link to development ready specifications and feature list examples. These are in the context specifically of within Turtle, but I would imagine them as a plain outline. So how you can use them, and I've gone through examples of single features, of full applications, that kind of go through how you can give enough context for a developer to understand it, even start giving some estimates against something, and what that can look like in a real use case. I wouldn't get stuck on this being used just in Turtle. I would think about how this can be used in like a normal outline or a normal presentation or a normal video. And then the other one is just dev ready specifications with some fundamental rules, tools that you can use, mindset to use, and some examples at the end there as well. Finally, our guest tomorrow is going to be Sid. I hope all of you can join us. I'm super excited for him to be here. I mean, I don't know if anybody in this room has built a billion-dollar company or the world's largest remote-based company. He has. He's very transparent about how he does business. There's like a whole, the whole business is an open book. They publish everything online from their operations, their hiring process, their equity packages, their internal design and dev processes. Even like how to schedule a meeting with Sid is posted on those guides. I think he's an incredible speaker. I posted some resources into his prior podcasts, others. I really like that 20-minute VC one because he asks some really interesting questions, but he's been on a bunch of different shows and conferences already. For tomorrow, the way that we'll structure it is I'll spend 10 minutes just asking a few basic starter questions. I'll ask him intro us. I'll try to ask some interesting ones to get us started. And then after that, I want to make sure to open it to you and a few other guests that will be joining us. So the way in which we'll do it so that it's organized is just chat me when you have a question. And ideally, please make it public, so using Zoom. So just go to chat and then to everyone, just write out the question. That way, not only do we know kind of who's in queue, but we also know if somebody else might be asking the same question, then you don't have to ask it. So just questions should come inside of the group chat on Zoom, and that's how we'll go through everyone. I would spend some time, looking into GitLab, looking into Sid, and prepping those questions. I think it's a great opportunity not only to learn from him, but if you're doing anything that's remotely relative in business to be able to make an impression on someone like that, I think is a great opportunity. So I would spend some time looking at prior interviews with Sid and prepping those questions. For those competing for the 5K in credit, these are the 3 fundamental things that we're going to ask developers to evaluate you on. So do you completely understand what done means? I would use examples, I would use metaphors, I would make sure that there's an end-to-end explanation of what is it that you're building. Are you excited to work on this? So a lot of that's going to come from the story, your background, however you can pitch this. can you do it in less than 100 hours? Or is there a version of it that you can do in less than 100 hours? So this is where it becomes important to kind of define what is it that we're building now? What is the North Star? What are those nice to haves? And that's the way that you can really communicate pieces that a developer can pick up and say, yes, this makes sense in 100 hours, or like, no way, they want a custom backend and they're building some crazy VR application. There's no way that this will get done in that time. For submissions, please submit by next Thursday. That'll be August 29th. We'll send that pretty quickly through developers that we have that are voting on this. And then we're going to share a winner on OpenLand. Please don't do this if you're only doing it for the credit. I think that'll be a waste of your time. I think that'd be a waste of Turtle's time and resources, the developer's time. If the only reason that you're doing this is because you can get 5K credit, I don't think that there will be something real enough behind that submission to win. But two, I just think it's a waste of everyone's time. Like the best case scenario for everyone here is that we have a great winner, and then every runner-up is put into a great position to build this, whether they build this themselves or with other developers or in the future. Please only do this if this is a real product that really matters to you, your business, and it'll matter even if the credit wasn't here. We will make sure to get detailed feedback on all runner-ups and their submissions. So that'll include developer feedback, that'll include our own feedback, so that it's not a complete waste of anyone's time. And we hope that there not only will be a great winner here, but also a bunch of other products that are set up for future success. That's going to wrap up the content here, and I really appreciate everyone doing this for the first time. You know, Founder Lab was just an idea a few months ago, and I really hope that it's helped bring all of you from you know, a point of being experts in your field to also being able to know the ins and outs of the design, dev, budgeting process, and I hope that you all feel much more confident and in control of working with your devs or outside devs or your own team in general. But seriously, you know, you've put in a considerable amount of time over the last 6 weeks, and I just, you know, can't stress how much I appreciate you all doing that. You know, time is finite, and I really appreciate you spending it with us. So thank you all for participating. I have some time if anybody has any questions or wants to jump into their specific.